Lessee enters into a 10-year lease for 5,000 square meters of office space. The annual lease payments are rupees 1 lakh payable at the end of each year. The interest rate implicit in the lease cannot be readily determined. Okay, so it's a 10-year lease, 5,000 square meters of office space and 1 lakh which is payable at the end of the year. Lesser's incremental borrowing rate at the commencement date is 6%. So this will become our discount rate. At the beginning of year 6, we can say is as good as end of the 5th year. Lessee and the lessor agreed to amend the original lease to reduce the space to only 2,500 square meters. So we are planning to reduce the space. If you are planning to reduce the space, that means there shall be reduction in the scope of the lease to only 2,500 square meters of the original space, starting from the end of the first quarter of year 6. The annual fixed lease payments from year 6 to year 10 are 60,000. Lesser's incremental borrowing rate at the beginning of year 6 is 5%. Earlier it was 6%, now it has got reduced to 5%. How should the said modification be accounted for? Please understand, it's a 10-year lease, right? So originally it is turning out to be 10 years. Then they are saying at the beginning of year 6, as we are saying, it is as good as end of the 5th year. So 5 years have already gone by. So 5 years are left. Okay, 5 years are left. And now they are saying that from year 6 to year 10. Now year 6 to year 10 is nothing but these 5 years. So there is no change in the lease term. Your lease term is remaining the same. Whatever was the original lease term of 10 years, only that will continue. Only thing is, instead of 5,000 square meters, we are bringing it down to 2,500 square meters. So there is a decrease in the scope of the lease, but no change in the lease term. Lease term is remaining the same. Based on this, they are saying, how should the said modification be accounted for? Okay. We again check with the modification. Yes. This is the place where it is falling this time. The lease scope is decreasing or the lease term is decreasing, right? This is what is happening. In this question, the lease scope is decreasing. The lease term is remaining the same, but the scope of the lease is decreasing. So what should we do in this kind of a situation? You have to de-recognize the lease liability. You have to de-recognize the ROU asset to reflect the partial termination of the lease. So there is a partial termination over here. Earlier it was for 5,000 square meters. Now only 2,500 square meters. So 50% of the lease has got terminated. So for that, if there is any gain or loss, it should be recognized in the P&L. So that's what they are saying, that you should recognize in the P&L the gain or loss on the termination of the lease. How that shall be done? That's the subject matter of this question. So what we will have to do is we'll have to first carry out the measurement of the initial lease liability. In initial lease liability, what will happen is you have 10 years, your lease payment is 1 lakh, which we will have to discount at 6%. Now this is exactly what we had done in the earlier question. I will make reference to the earlier question that we solved so that certain figures which are readily available, we can just use those figures. We don't want to spend our time solving the same thing with using different figures. So they are saying it is 1 lakh, it is 6%. Then why can't we just simply pick up from the earlier question? Just see the earlier question. See, in earlier question also it was 10 year. Earlier question also it was 1 lakh. Earlier question also it was 6%. Exactly what is there in this question, isn't it? And we have already measured the initial lease liability. We realize it is 7,36,000. So in this question also, I will use that particular figure. So we say measurement of initial lease liability And then we say rupees 7,36,000 from earlier question. You can of course solve it again. If you have a lot of time, you may solve it again. In exams, of course, you have to solve. In exams, you will not be able to refer earlier questions. In exam, you will solve. How will you solve in the exams? This way. Here it is. 1 lakh will be discounted for 10 years at 6%. We get 7,36,000. But because the figures are the same, I personally believe that we can just rely on the calculations that we did in the earlier question. Great. Now we are doing modification at the beginning of year 6. Here it is, at the beginning of year 6, which is as good as the end of the 5th year. So I will require the carrying amount of the lease liability at the beginning of the, at the end of the 5th year. So at the end of 5th year, what is the carrying amount? That will be required. Again, the calculations that we did in the earlier question will help us, because you must have taken 7,36,000 in the earlier question, and using that you must have determined that what are the carrying amounts. Okay, so let me again check the earlier question solution. Here it is. In the earlier question, we had determined the carrying amount at the end of the 6th year. This time I want carrying amount at the end of the 5th year. Here it is. This is the carrying amount at the end of the 5th year, isn't it? So for this question, 4,21,225, that is the relevant figure. We say determination of carrying amount of original lease liability on date of modification, that is beginning of 6th year, that is end of 5th year. Okay, end of 5th year. We say rupees 4,21,225. We make life easier by referring the earlier question. It's 4,21,225. How we got it? Here is that entire calculation, right? The earlier question solution. We should now get the modified liability. Measurement of modified lease liability. Finally, we will have to do some work now. Right, we will have to do some work now. This we will not get from the earlier question. We will have to calculate it. Discount rate has changed to 5% now. You check with the question. 5 years are left. Here it is on the side. 5 years are left, and during these 5 years we will be paying lease rent of 60,000. Yes, we'll use that information. So the modified lease liability, it will be 2,59,740. 259,740. Yeah. Yes, we are checking now this gain or loss, how that is to be really done. Right? The lease scope is decreasing this time. So this is what is happening. They are saying de-recognize the lease liability and ROU asset to reflect the partial termination of the lease. The lease is not getting completely terminated, but the lease is getting terminated for a certain portion. We entered into a lease agreement for 5,000 square meters. We are bringing it down to 2,500 square meters. We are reducing, or we can say in a way, we are terminating the lease partially to the extent of 50%. This partial derecognition shall result into some gain or loss. This gain or loss has to be recognized in the P&L. So let us see this. We have to derecognize a part of the lease liability. You have to also derecognize a part of the ROU asset. We say determination of carrying amount of ROU asset. Okay, ROU asset on date of modification. See, originally your ROU asset was for 5,000 square meters. After the modification, your ROU asset should be only for 2,500 square meters. So we cannot continue showing the original ROU asset. You get my point? Here ROU asset also has to be adjusted. So I have to find out that what is the balance of the ROU asset before I make modification. And then we will give the effect of the modification. So we say here, original ROU asset. We recognize the ROU asset at 7,36,000, right? Your initial lease liability was 7,36,000. And because there are no other elements, your ROU asset will be also 7,36,000. We are making modification at the end of the 5th year. So you must have charged depreciation for 5 years. So less depreciation for 5 years. 7,36,000. They haven't given us any salvage value. You must be depreciating it over 10 years into 5. 3,68,000. 3,68,000. ROU asset on date of modification. $3,68,000 is reflecting 5,000 square meters. Now the revised reality is that your lease is only for 2,500 square meters. There is a reduction of 50%. So that thing should now settle in. Original lease is for 5,000 square meters. We'll stop. Modified lease is for 2,500 square meters. Implies scope of lease has reduced by 50%. Right, your scope of the lease has reduced by 50%. We say determination of gain oblique loss to be recognized for reduction in scope of lease. For reduction in scope of lease. I hope you have written till here. If you are still writing, just pause the video here. Now see. Understand this whole thing. See. Your original lease liability is 4,21,225. This 4,21,225 is reflecting your liability for 5,000 square meters. Now my liability should be only for 2,500 square meters. So 50% of the lease liability should be de-recognized. Again, I'll repeat, 4,21,225, this figure, right? 4,21,225, that is the carrying amount of the original lease liability on the date of modification. 4,21,225 is reflecting your liability for 5,000 square meters. But the revised reality is that your liability should be now only for 2,500 square meters. So 50% reduction is there. So 50% of the liability should be de-recognized. So we say 50% reduction in original lease liability. 421,225 into 50%. $210,613. And then we say less 50% reduction in original ROU asset. The same logic over here. This ROU asset that you are showing the ROU asset as 3,68,000. This is showing the balance for the ROU asset for 5,000 square meters. Now the balance of the ROU asset should be for 2,500 square meters. So 3,68,000 should also be reduced by 50%. So 50% reduction in the original ROU asset. 3,68,000 into 50%. $1,84,000 difference. $26,630. What do you say, gain or loss? Liability is reducing by 2,10,613 while asset is reducing by 1,84,000. In other words, liability is decreasing by a higher amount of 26,613. A higher reduction in liability means there is a gain. So this is gain on scope reduction. Right, the lease scope is reducing. There is a gain of 26,613. We can put an accounting entry for the same. right? You can put an accounting entry for the same. What do you say? Lease liability is decreasing. Liability has a credit balance. It is decreasing. So debited. Lease liability account debit. 2,10,613. ROU asset is also decreasing. So 2 ROU asset account, right? Asset has a debit balance. It is decreasing. 1,84,000. 2 profit and loss account. The difference 26,630. If you are still writing this, just pause the video here and complete it. However, it is still not the end. The lease liability still needs to be modified. See, we have calculated the modified lease liability. Here it is. What has happened is now your new lease rent is 60,000. Whatever adjustments that you have done it for the original lease terms. But the revised term is that now you are going to pay 60,000 rupees. So understand one thing. The liability in your books should be now 2,59,740. So we have to remeasure the lease liability and it should be now 259,740. The remeasured lease liability, we will compare with how much balance of lease liability as per the original terms is left. So the difference will be the adjustment to be made. And this adjustment in the lease liability will be routed through, obviously, the ROU asset. Okay. So I'll do a calculation parallel over here. Say effect of remeasurement of lease liability. Remeasurement of lease liability. Modified lease liability. The new terms are 60,000. The new discount rate is 5%. Considering that in my books now the lease liability should be 2,59,740. This I will compare with the balance of the original lease liability. Okay. So I will say less balance of original lease liability on date of modification, after reduction. Understand that your original lease liability was 4,21,225, but you have already reduced it by 50%. From 5,000 square meters, it became 2,500 square meters. So 50% of that I have already removed from my books. In the earlier accounting entry, lease liability account was debited, isn't it? So I have already reduced it by 50%. So 421,225 minus 50%, I'll say it is 2,10,612. So in your books right now, the lease liability is 210,612. It should be updated to 259,740. So I get 49,128. Adjusted to ROU asset, right? So I'm remeasuring the lease liability. After all the scope reduction and all, my liability in the books was 2,10,612. But remember, this 2,10,612 is for 2,500 square meters agreed, but at the original discount rate of 6%. Now the discount rate has become 5%. Originally, you calculated using a lease rent of 1 lakh. Now the revised discount rate is 5% and the lease rent is 60,000. So the lease liability in my books should be 259,740. It is 210,612. So difference I am adjusting. You are increasing the liability this time, and this increase in liability will be through the increase in the ROU asset. Asset is increasing, debited, liability is increasing, credited. So if you are saying what can be the accounting entry, the accounting entry is very simple. Yes, it's very simple. Accounting entry. What do you say? Accounting entry. Yes. ROU asset account debit 49,128 to lease liability account, isn't it? 49,128. Yeah, that will be the end of this question.